Hi everyone, I am Dr. Anisha, your microbiology faculty, and in today's session, I will be discussing about a bacteria whose pathogenesis is majorly toxin mediated. So, I will be discussing about Clostridium species. And under Clostridium species, I will be talking about the different species which are associated with human infections, their differentiation majorly based on the morphology and the disease manifestations, along with most important point or most important section, that is toxins, different types of toxins they produce and the mechanisms of those toxins associated with disease manifestations. So, in general, let's first talk about Clostridium species as a bacteria, right? So, these bacteria are gram-positive, obligate anaerobes, and these are bacilli, gram-positive bacilli. And when we say these are obligate anaerobes, it is defined as a characteristic which shows that oxygen is lethal for their survival and their existence, right? So this is one of the most important things we should know about Clostridium species, because once we try to grow them, once we try to cultivate them, these need to have a strict anaerobic condition. So, what are the important species which are associated with human infections? So, we'll be discussing about 4 important species. For example, Clostridium perfringens, Clostridium botulinum, Clostridium tetani, and one important species, Clostridium difficile, which has now changed its name to Clostridioides difficile. So, Clostridium difficile has been moved to a different genera, Clostridioides, as a whole bacteria. It is kept under a different genera. So, we will write its name as Clostridioides difficile, right? So, naturally, Clostridium is non-capsulated, but there are 2 species which are capsulated, we must know. So, now when we say capsule, it is somehow a covering which is present on the bacteria. So, can we say it is Clostridium perfringens, with perfringens? Can we use a mnemonic parda? Parda means a covering or a layer it forms, right? So, perfringens, and also butter. If we apply butter on a toast, it somehow provides a layer or a covering to the bread, right? So, can we say that Clostridium butyricum is also one such species which is capsulated, right? With capsule, we means a layer, outer covering. So, it is the parda and the butter which is providing outer covering to these specific bacteria. So, important question, a one-liner question, which amongst these are considered as capsulated Clostridia species? So, Clostridium perfringens and butyricum, right? And Clostridia are motile with the help of Peritrichus flagella, but there are 3 species which are non-motile, right? So, let's talk about those 3 species. For that, let us use the mnemonic TRP, right? So, it is Clostridium tetani, serotype 6, then Clostridium ramosum, and one species which is very common, it is Clostridium perfringens. So are we able to use this mnemonic TRP in the species which are non-motile Clostridia species, right? So now these are important one-liners. We must know what are non-motile, what are capsulated Clostridia. So now moving on to one important differentiation or morphological differentiation which very well helps us get or solve these image-based questions which come from Clostridia. So there are two features we must know, whether these are oval or spherical spores, and also what is the location of these spores in the bacilli. That's very important. And one more important thing about Clostridium species that these produce, Clostridia, they produce bulging spores. Bulging spores, another bacteria which is spore producing but has non-bulging spores, are the Bacillus species, right? So Clostridia, they produce bulging spores. And what are the different spore types? Oval spores and spherical spores. So there's only one species that produces spherical spores, we must know, and that is Clostridium tetani, which has these spherical spores. And all the other species, major pathogenic species to human beings, they produce oval spores. So what are the other species which we discussed? It is the Clostridium perfringens. It is Clostridium tertium, Clostridium bifermentans. So Clostridium perfringens is producing oval spores. Then Clostridium tetani has spherical spores, tertium has oval spores, and bifermentans also has oval spores, right? Now, importance about the spore location and how it helps us differentiate different species. So firstly, when we talk about terminal spores, when we have terminal spores, terminal means at the end. Suppose this is a bacilli and we have the spore at the very end of the bacilli. That is defined as terminal spores. And what are the species which have terminal spores? We have two species. One is Clostridium tetani and Clostridium tertium. But what is the difference? Tetani, we have already discussed that it is going to have spherical spores, but it is tertium species which is, although it is going to have terminal spores, but it is going to be oval in nature. Yeah. Oval terminals, right? So next comes another location which is central spore location. And what is that species which is producing central spores? Central spore means there's this bacilli, and in the very middle of the bacilli we have a spore which is dividing the bacilli into two halves. So what is this bacilli? What is this species which produces central spore? And from the name itself we can derive a spore which is dividing the bacilli into two parts. So what is the species? It is Clostridium bi. Bi means two, bifermentans. Clostridium bifermentans, right? And another location which is one of the most common location often asked in your exams, it is the subterminal or peripheral. Subterminal spore or peripheral. What do you mean by subterminal or peripheral? Subterminal or peripheral is that it is towards the periphery, but it is not exactly end of the bacilli. What does that imply? That the bacilli would be present towards the periphery, but it is not going to be present at the end. So there's some bacilli, some amount of bacilli which would be present there. So this is subterminal location. Subterminal location of the spore. So what is the species which is producing subterminal spore? It is most famous species, that is Clostridium perfringens. Perfringens. So from the name itself we can derive that it is at the periphery but not at the very end. So perfringens produces subterminal or peripheral spore. Most often you will be asked about this term, that is subterminal spore, right? So now let us discuss about the different locations and the different morphological features. So in this image, we can very well see that there is spherical as well as terminal spore. So there is only one species which is producing spherical spore, which is Clostridium tetani. Clostridium tetani. And does it somehow seem like a morphological picture which looks like drumstick? A drumstick appearance? So there comes a question that what is one bacilli which gives a drumstick appearance? It is going to be Clostridium tetani, right? Now comes terminal spore, but it is oval. There is one terminal spore which is spherical, that is Clostridium tetani, and one terminal spore which is oval in shape. And what is that? Clostridium tertium. So we have an oval spore and at the end of the bacilli. So does it give us a picture of somehow a tennis racket? Tennis racket appearance? This also concludes with a question that what is one bacilli which is giving a tennis racket appearance, right? Next image, very easy. What is that one spore which is dividing the bacilli into two parts? It is the Clostridium bifermentans. There is one spore, central spore, which is oval in nature, which is oval, and it is dividing the bacilli into two equal parts. So that is Clostridium bifermentans for you, right? And what is that oval and subterminal spore or at the periphery? At the very periphery but not at the end, it is the Clostridium perfringens. There is a spore which is present and there's some part of the bacilli which is remaining, right? So that concludes our Clostridium perfringens or subterminal spore. So let's see that with the help of an image. So in this image, if we zoom, can we see a bacilli? This is a bacilli and there's a spore. There's a spore, and this bacilli also has one part which is coming above the spore. So what is this bacilli? What is this species which is producing such spore? A bacilli which has a spore and it has some part of the bacilli which is coming at the end. It is nothing but Clostridium perfringens. Clostridium perfringens. But if asked in exam, this is one species which does not produce spore in a culture, right? So if you get such bacteria from culture, you will not be able to see these spores. It is not going to produce spores in vitro, in tissues or in culture. So you won't be able to see the spores, but this is how exactly the Clostridium perfringens spores look like, right? And what is the morphological picture of Clostridia or the name of the morphology that is given to Clostridium perfringens bacilli as a whole? It is the boxcar shaped bacilli. So the bacilli, they exactly look like this on microscopy, right? So there is another question. What is the bacteria which shows boxcar shaped appearance? That is Clostridium perfringens. Now let's move on to the next picture. I think this is very easy for us to identify. We have a bacilli and we have a spherical spore at the end, at the terminal end. So what is this species? It is Clostridium tetani. And a lot of spores would be seen on smear. So let's move on to the different species, their toxins and the clinical manifestations produced by these. So firstly, we'll be talking about the bacteria that is Clostridium botulinum. So we have already discussed that this Clostridium bacilli as a whole, its pathogenesis is toxin mediated, right? So what is this toxin we are talking about in Clostridium botulinum? It is botulinum toxin. So from the name itself can we derive this word num. Num, if we use it as a mnemonic, that is numb, it has a numbing effect. And when we talk about any numbing effect, are we discussing about some neurological defect that is happening, some neurological dysfunction that occurs? So what is the characteristic of this toxin, this botulinum toxin, which stands for numbing, or we can use it as numbing. So what type of toxin it is? It is neurological toxin, neurotoxin we can say. So botulinum toxin, numb, it somehow shows us numbing effect, or it has a neurological effect on our body. So it is a neurotoxin, one important question, right? And what is the mechanism of this toxin? What does botulinum toxin do? So this toxin, once it is very important that it is not the bacteria which is producing the clinical manifestation, it is the toxin, right? So once this bacteria enters our body, so how is this going to affect us? So we'll be getting spores in our body. So what are these spores? In what condition can we get these spores? We can get it via some wound injuries. We can have it by inhalation or aerosols, or we can directly get them by injection, right? So once our body gets these spores enter the bloodstream and they enter the cholinergic peripheral nerve terminals, right? So they enter cholinergic peripheral nerve terminals. So what are the most common nerve terminals we are talking about? So we are talking about, firstly, most common it is the neuromuscular junction. Then they act on postganglionic, parasympathetic, sympathetic nerve endings, parasympathetic nerve fibers, right? And then peripheral ganglia. So what exactly it is doing at these sites? So this toxin, it inhibits the release of ACH at the nerve terminals. So inhibits ACH release. So it binds to ACH receptors and it inhibits the ACH release, which leads to the end condition, that is flaccid paralysis. Flaccid paralysis. Right? So this is the exact mechanism by which this botulinum toxin acts. It acts at neuromuscular junction, it inhibits the ACH release, ultimately leading to flaccid paralysis. Right? So, firstly, let us discuss about the different serotypes. It is very important, it is asked as question for the different serotypes which are responsible and which cause different disease manifestations, right? So, firstly, we must know the number of serotypes for Clostridium botulinum. We have, suppose this is Clostridium botulinum. So, Does it look like 8? Right? B, it somehow is looking like an 8, so we have 8 serotypes. Right? So what are these 8 serotypes? So these are just letters A, B, C1, C2, D, E, F, G. Right? A being the most severe one. It produces most severe condition, right? And these are all one-liners which we get asked. So all of these serotypes all are neurotoxic except one. And what is that one condition, one serotype which is not neurotoxic but it is enterotoxic or enterotoxin? It is the C2 which is enterotoxic. So how do we learn that? C say we can consider colon. So we have two types of intestines, large intestine and small intestine. It is not exactly two intestines, but we have small and large intestine. So it is, and with intestine, can we derive the word entero, right? So C2 is enterotoxic in nature, whereas all others are neurotoxic, right? So these are the different serotypes which are associated with disease manifestations of botulinum, right? So other serotypes I was talking about is, it is not just the A serotype or B or C, it is all the 8 serotypes that we need to discuss, we need to know. Now to discuss about the clinical manifestations, we should remember 5 Ds for Clostridium botulinum infection. This gets very easy. So 5 Ds, what are these 5 Ds? So patient will have firstly diplopia. Patient will also have dysphagia. Then patient will have dysarthria. Diplopia, dysphagia, dysarthria. Then there will be decreased deep tendon reflexes. Since there's this flaccid paralysis, and there's going to be descending flaccid paralysis. So these are the 5 Ds you must remember for Clostridium botulinum infection, right? So now talking about the different types of botulism or different manifestations, how we get the infection and what are the different risk factors or different conditions in which we can have botulinum. Firstly, this is the wound botulinum. Wound botulism. How is that occurring? It can be due to road traffic accidents, right? When there is massive abrasions, a lot of abrasion and a lot of contamination of the wound. It can, most commonly, it can also be seen in IV drug users, or any such condition when there's a lot of contamination of the skin and subcutaneous tissue which moves deeper to the muscle level as well, right? So one is wound botulism. Then another important is foodborne botulism. And what type of food are we talking about? We are talking about canned food items, right? And third one is very important, that is infant botulism. Infant botulism. And how is that occurring? That is occurring because of this old practice of giving honey to infants, and this honey is contaminated with spores of Clostridium botulinum. So naturally, we must know that these spores do not in general germinate in human adult intestine, but these spores, they germinate in infant intestines, and they will be responsible for development of more and more spores and development of toxins, right? So this gets very dangerous if the honey is contaminated with Clostridium botulinum, right? So this infant botulism, a very important, a very favorite question for infant botulism is this floppy baby syndrome. Floppy baby syndrome. What exactly is happening here? So, of course, there is flaccid paralysis because of ingestion of honey. Ingestion of honey causes flaccid paralysis. So, what is happening here? There is hypotonia. So, the patient is very, very weak. There's extreme weakness. Extreme weakness. The infant is unable to suck and swallow, unable to suck and swallow. There's going to be fever. And there's going to be, can you see this neck where the infant is unable to hold it and there's extreme weakness. So we call it floppy neck. Floppy neck, right? So this is the typical picture of floppy baby syndrome. And this is occurring because of botulinum toxin, which is a neurotoxin, and it is causing flaccid paralysis. Very, very important, right? So now discussing about important flashcard, which is going to recapitulate all the important points for Clostridium botulinum as it is concerned with the clinical manifestations and the toxins. Firstly, it is it is the botulinum toxin Bt. So with B, can we derive the number of serotypes? It is the 8 serotypes. 8 serotypes. Right? And what comes? The most severe serotype? It is the A serotype. Most severe. Right? Then what is happening at the neuromuscular junction? It is the block. And what is blocked at neuromuscular junction? It is ACH release, which is blocked. Then C1, what is C1? And with C, what can we derive for Clostridium botulinum? Can we say that it can occur because of canned food, right? Then we have C2. What is C2? It is the enterotoxin. Enterotoxin, only toxin for Clostridium botulinum, that is enterotoxin, which is C2 serotype. Then with D, can we derive the 5 Ds? Diplopia, dysphagia, dysarthria, right? Then with A, so we must know one important thing about Clostridium is that its toxin, it is not present in neurotoxic form. So it is present as a protoxin, but it is the enzymes which are going to convert this protoxin into a potent toxin. So what are these enzymes? Trypsin. Most commonly, it is converting the protoxin to toxin. So it is converting into inactive state, it into inactive to an active form, right? Then with F, we can have flaccid paralysis, floppy child syndrome, floppy baby syndrome. And with G, it is acting at postganglionic parasympathetic nerve endings, nerve terminals, right? So are we able to derive all the important one-liners or the important these questions related to the toxins or the clinical manifestations, right? So now let us move on to the next species, which is Clostridioides difficile. So also always write Clostridioides difficile. So this Clostridioides difficile, again we are using C and D from the name itself as mnemonics. So what does C stand for? C stands for colitis, one thing. And with D, can we say that there's some discrepancy or there's some difficulty in defecation? So can we write diarrhea with D? One thing from D. And another important thing, a very, very important case-based scenario from Clostridioides difficile is that what is the most common bacteria which is associated with antibiotic use? It is the Clostridioides difficile. So can we use D as the Y? So a bacterial infection which is associated with excessive antimicrobial use. It is Clostridioides difficile infection. So this is very upcoming question, a case-based scenario which gets asked. So what are the risk factors for development of this sort of infection? One we have already discussed. So there's going to be excessive antimicrobial use. Then can we say that prolonged hospital stay also predisposes us to development of this infection? Because there is going to be colonization of these spores of these bacteria in the gut of the patients in hospitals, right? So there's a lot of antibiotic, antimicrobials which are getting used in the hospitals. So there's a lot of colonization of the spores, right? Then can we say that there can be an immunosuppression which predisposes the patients to development of Clostridioides infection? Because what happens in immunosuppression, so it does not allow the primary bile salts to convert into secondary bile salts. So these secondary bile salts, these are necessary for prevention of germination of these spores, these Clostridioides difficile spores. So in immunosuppressed state, so there's a lot of germination of these spores, and there's disruption of normal flora which is present in a human body. So it acts as a niche for the development or growth or germination of the spores of Clostridioides difficile bacteria, right? So when we say there is disrupted normal flora, and disrupted normal flora can be due to any condition. It is not just the immunosuppression which is acting as a source or as a feature for disruption of normal flora. It can be because of prolonged inflammatory conditions of the intestine, right? So can we also say that use of rectal thermometers can act as the source of germination of these bacteria, right? So these are all important risk factors which predispose to the development of such conditions. And naturally, immunosuppressed state, we can say patient might be having AIDS infections, right? And if there is any prolonged illness, all of these culminate into the immunosuppressed states or prolonged debilitated states. So it is one such condition which predisposes the patients to development of such infections. So what are the antibiotics which are associated with the development of pseudomembrane colitis? So another, this important point which I missed for Clostridioides difficile is that it is not just causing colitis, it is not just causing the inflammation or infection of the intestine, but it also forms the layer in the intestine which is pseudomembrane. We'll be discussing this in the later section. See what is the pathogenesis of the formation of this pseudomembrane. So what are the antibiotics which are associated with pseudomembrane colitis? So the most commonly used antibiotics nowadays, like cephalosporins firstly. Can we say ceftriaxone as an example? Then we have clindamycin. Can we also say ampicillin? Ampicillin use. And can we say fluoroquinolones also? Fluoroquinolones, which predisposes the community to development of such condition, that is. So can we say ciprofloxacin? So these are few antibiotics which are most commonly associated with development of pseudomembrane colitis. And there are certain antibiotics which are given as a treatment of pseudomembrane colitis. But if they are also given for a very long duration, they can also predispose the individuals to development of such conditions. So now talking about the toxins, we've already discussed that Clostridioides or Clostridium infections are toxin mediated. So what are the two important toxins that these produce? So these are all exotoxins, right? Exotoxins. So what are the two different exotoxins that Clostridioides produces? These are toxin A and toxin B. Another question. What type of toxin is toxin A? It is enterotoxin. Enterotoxin. A enter. A and enter, they somehow sound similar, right? So A is enterotoxin and B is cytotoxin. So it is not just one toxin which is responsible for the disease manifestation. It is the two different toxins and some other factors also which are responsible for the manifestations, right? And you must remember that only the toxigenic strains of Clostridioides are responsible for toxigenic strains of Clostridioides difficile are responsible for pseudomembrane colitis. Very, very importantly asked, which are the non-toxigenic strain also producing such disease manifestation? It is always the toxigenic strains which are producing the pseudomembrane colitis. So what is the mechanism? How is this pseudomembrane forming? So what happens? These Clostridioides difficile, they spores germinate in the intestine when there is disruption of the normal flora, right? Normally, otherwise also, what is happening, they are entering inside. It is not just the spore, but spore germination that is producing the manifestation. So these spores germinate, and once germinated, they form toxins. They produce toxin A and toxin B. So what is the role of these toxins? These toxins, they cause disruption of epithelial barriers. They are causing disruption of epithelial barriers. They are producing rounding of cells as well. They are changing the morphology. They're changing the shape. And morphology, right? So what is released because of the toxin? There's a lot of inflammatory response which is produced with the help of different cytokines, and there's neutrophil recruitment also, right? So all of this colonization, the different cytokine production, there's disruption of epithelial barriers. All of this is producing the colonization of these bacteria, and these are ultimately leading to the development of pseudomembrane. So what is this pseudomembrane we are talking about? So can you appreciate these yellowish areas, yellowish plaques which are produced in the intestine? So these are nothing but pseudomembranes which are formed. So these yellowish white plaques. So these can be as small as 1 to 2 mm, and in later stages they can cover the entire surface of the intestine, the entire area of the intestine. So ultimately leading to the disease manifestations of this pseudomembrane, right? So what is the pseudomembrane? Naturally, it is going to have cellular debris. Then it is going to have these destructed leukocytes. It is going to have mucin, right? All of these structures and neutrophils, etc., leukocytes, neutrophils, etc. All of these will compose the this pseudomembrane, right? And this will be attached to underlying structures, right? So now there are some important points we should talk about Clostridioides apart from the toxin mechanism and the disease manifestation. So firstly, what are we collecting? Because it's causing diarrhea, it is causing colitis, pseudomembrane colitis, it is causing diarrhea. So what is the sample we are taking? We are talking about the stool sample, and we'll be taking stool for culture. And important point for culture of such bacteria that we need to have anaerobic condition. Anaerobic incubation is to be done, right? So what are the culture medias which are important for Clostridioides difficile infection, the Clostridioides difficile bacteria? So we can derive it with the help of a mnemonic, that is Clostridium cytotoxin forms a yellow layer. So it is not Clostridium, but it is Clostridioides. So it is cefoxitin, C for cefoxitin, C for cycloserine, fructose agar. So CCFA and CCYA. So it is cefoxitin, cycloserine, egg yolk agar, which can be used as culture of Clostridioides difficile, right? So then there is this cytotoxin neutralization assay, which is also a specific, very important test. Neutralization assay, which can be done. Then, of course, we can go for the H&E study. We can do colonoscopy. All of these tests can be done, right? So, these are the important things that we need to talk about in lab diagnosis. And for treatment, otherwise, we are providing vancomycin, and metronidazole as drugs. And in very severe cases, when the pseudomembrane colitis causes very severe condition wherein the patient is unable to grow the normal flora in its intestine. So what do we do? A very, very upcoming important topic for you, it is fecal transplant therapy or fecal matter transplant. Fecal transplant. So what exactly are we doing in this condition? So we take this stool sample from a healthy donor. We take stool sample from a healthy donor, and healthy donor has, naturally he is going to have good bacteria. It is going to have good amount of these bacteria, right? So what we do, we are going to process the stool sample and in such a way that it forms pills or some liquid, in whether they are produced in pill form, they are kept in capsule form, or they are provided as liquid. So we are going to take all of that from a healthy donor and we are going to give to the patient, right? A patient of pseudomembrane colitis. So the liquid can be transferred via NG tubes, or it can be delivered via colonoscopy, right? And in certain conditions, these capsules also can be administered that way as well, right? So this is a very upcoming important point about treatment part or very difficult cases, in severe cases of Clostridioides difficile infection, right? So let's talk about the important flashcard when we talk about Clostridioides difficile. So we have A, B, C and D. So what does A and B stand for? These of course are the toxins A and B. C stands for colitis. What are the antibiotics which are associated with this disease condition? Ceftriaxone, or we can say cephalosporins. We need to do cultures, right? Cycloserine, cefoxitin culture, right? And with D, we can derive diarrhea as well as dawaii, right? So this ABCD helps us talk about the little important things about Clostridioides difficile infection. Now moving on to the next important bacteria, which is Clostridium perfringens, right? So Clostridium perfringens, it is a capsulated Clostridia, one thing, right? And it is non-motile. And what is the kind of motility that Clostridium shows? It is, otherwise the motile species, they show stately motility. So now talking about the virulence of Clostridium perfringens. So there are a lot of toxins which are associated with the virulence of this Clostridial infection. So we have few major toxins as well as minor toxins. So how are we going to remember these major toxins? Firstly, with the help of a mnemonic, that Alia Bhatt eats ice. So what are the major toxins? She's a major actress, right? So what are the major toxins associated? So these are A, B, A and I. Alia Bhatt eats ice. So it is alpha toxin, beta toxin, epsilon toxin and iota toxin. So these are 4 major toxins which are associated with virulence of Clostridium perfringens infections. So what are the minor toxins? So we have kappa, lambda, theta, mu, nu and eta. So important roles of these major toxins and minor toxins, some important ones that you should know. This alpha toxin has lecithinase activity. Lecithinase activity, or we can say phospholipase C activity. Right? One thing. Then important toxin, that is theta toxin. It is hemolytic. And this alpha toxin is also hemolytic. This is also hemolytic, right? Now moving towards another important species of Clostridium, it is Clostridium perfringens. Now Clostridium perfringens, it is one bacteria, one species of Clostridium that is capsulated and it is non-motile. So now, one important feature about Clostridium is that what is the kind of motility that Clostridium depicts? It is stately motility. Stately motility if it is asked in your exam. So Clostridium perfringens, it is non-motile as well as it is capsulated. So the virulence of this particular species, it is associated with a lot of toxins. So there are number of major and minor toxins. It is divided into major and minor toxins, right? So what are the major toxins? We must know, and there are certain 4 toxins, major toxins, which are associated, and then we have minor toxins. So what are the major toxins? We can learn them with the help of a mnemonic, that is Alia Bhatt eats ice. Alia Bhatt is a major actress, right? She's a major actress and she eats ice. So ABEI. So what are the major toxins? So we have ABEI, right? A stands for alpha toxin. B stands for beta. E stands for epsilon. And I stands for iota, right? So what are the minor toxins we can talk about? So these are gamma, delta, lambda, kappa, theta, mu, nu and eta. So certain roles of these toxins you must know. There are certain important ones which get asked. One is alpha toxin. So alpha toxin, all of these major toxins are lethal toxins, right? So these are all lethal first thing. So one important point, that alpha toxin, it has lecithinase activity. Or we can write phospholipase C activity, one thing. And it is also hemolytic. It is also hemolytic, right? Alpha toxin. Then this toxin, delta and theta toxin. These two toxins are also hemolytic. Then lambda toxin, L stands for lamb. Lamb, it is made up of proteins, right? So this has protease activity. K, kappa has collagenase activity. Collagenase activity. Right? And epsilon, it somehow has E, so it has permease activity. So these are important mechanisms of the major and minor toxins you must remember when it comes to your exam point of view, right? So some of the toxins, their mechanism is not defined, but these are some important ones which you must know. Major and minor toxins, right? So they also produce neuraminidase, then they can also produce histamine. They can also produce bursting factors, bursting factor, as certain other virulence factors. Now, what are the disease manifestations? What are the clinical manifestations associated with Clostridium perfringens infection? One is most common, most important with perfringens is gas gangrene. Gas gangrene. It can also produce food poisoning. It can also lead to development of skin and soft tissue infections. That it can cause meningitis. It can also lead to panophthalmitis. These are the most important clinical manifestations associated with Clostridium perfringens infection. And these are all the clinical manifestations we've already discussed about the Clostridium infection, right? So now, firstly, when we have spoken about it can produce food poisoning, or we can write enteric infections, it is not just food poisoning that it is causing. So when we talk about these enteric infections, we have a mnemonic which is PIGEON. P stands for food poisoning. Then G stands for gangrenous appendicitis. E stands for enteritis. Necroticans, and N stands for necrotizing enteritis. So these are the four important clinical manifestations of enteric infections associated with Clostridium perfringens infection. So when we talk about food poisoning, P, right? So what is the toxin which is associated with food poisoning? So it is Clostridium perfringens toxin A. Food poisoning, enteritis, right? So it is the Clostridium perfringens toxin A which is causing food poisoning. And what is the gene which is encoding it? It is CPE gene. Clostridium perfringens enterotoxin. We can say that, right? So what is enteritis necroticans and necrotizing enteritis? These two conditions, they are somehow similar. And in enteritis necroticans, the clinical picture is somewhat similar. There is going to be disruption, there's going to be necrosis of jejunum, and it is mediated, enteritis necroticans, it is mediated by a strain, that is Clostridium perfringens type C, which is producing a beta toxin. So how do we remember? Enteritis necroticans, which is caused by Clostridium perfringens type C. So necroticans, C. From necroticans, we can very well derive it, Clostridium perfringens type C. And what is happening in necrotizing enteritis? So there's also similar clinical picture, but the species which is associated, or the strain which is associated with it, is Clostridium perfringens type A. So these are two important things that you must remember for these species and the types of toxins it triggers. So what exactly is gas gangrene? First thing we must know about gas gangrene, that it is always going to be, it is not just one type of bacteria or one species of Clostridium which is producing gas gangrene, it is multiple species which are implicated in this infection. So it is, can we say that it is polymicrobial in nature? So what happens here, it is that the species Clostridium perfringens, which is responsible for majority of the cases, then there's species Clostridium septicum, which is the next important species associated with gas gangrene, and then we have another species Clostridium novae, which is also implicated, or it is also an important causative agent in Clostridium perfringens infection, right? So there's one important condition that is associated with Clostridium perfringens infection is the road traffic accidents. So what happens in road traffic accidents or such injuries? So there's crushed injury which is occurring. So because of this crushed injury, there is the destruction of all the major and minor arteries, right, in the legs. So because of that, there's ischemic condition which is created. Ischemia is created, and because of ischemia, blood supply is not able to reach the deeper sections. So there's decreased blood supply to deeper tissues. So what is this decreased blood supply? A lot of crush injury, anaerobic condition is created. Anaerobic condition is created in such crush injuries or such accidents where fracture is happening, blood vessels are disrupted. Then anaerobic environment is created which acts as a niche for the germination of the spores of these Clostridium perfringens bacteria, right? So this leads to development of the manifestation wherein there is necrosis, of very foul smelling necrosis. There is excessive gas which is produced in the tissue planes, right? And there is another brawny edema exactly happening there. So what is the presentation? So firstly, talking about the incubation period. So Clostridium perfringens, it is just a few hours, like 10 to 48 hours. Clostridium septicum, its incubation period is 2 to 3 days. And Clostridium novae, its incubation period is 5 to 6 days. So how does the patient present? So this is the classical picture of what this Clostridium perfringens gas gangrene looks like. Gas gangrene looks like. So how does the patient present? So we can use this mnemonic Clostridium perfringens bacilli. So patient has firstly crepitus. Crepitus is present. There's a lot of gas in the tissue planes, right? Then patient presents with excruciating pain. Second thing. Then there is serosanguinous discharge that comes out. Serosanguinous discharge, right? And also the patient has Brownie edema. Another important one-liner question. This, we can say that this is the triad we can use for gas gangrene infection or gas gangrenous condition caused by Clostridium and other species, right? So there's going to be crepitus, excruciating pain, and there's going to be serosanguinous discharge, there's going to be Brownie edema, and this is exactly the image that will be asked in your exams for such infection. Then some important tests which are asked as image-based questions in Clostridium perfringens. For the first image, we have, this is the egg yolk agar. Suppose this is the egg yolk agar. So what do we have here? We have Clostridium perfringens and we are seeing the activity of its toxin, right? So we have the Clostridium perfringens as bacteria. We have streak line or the growth of bacteria. And we have another bacteria as comparison, that is Clostridium sporogenes. So what is happening? This Clostridium perfringens, can you see in this one part where we have no antitoxin and the anti-alpha toxin. So in this section, no anti-alpha toxin, we have this opalescence. We have this opalescence which is present here in the image, right? This white area, milky white opalescence which is present around the streak line. So this is because of the activity of one of its toxin, that is alpha toxin, which has lecithinase activity. It is due to the lecithinase activity that this opalescence is produced, right? So now to see the function or the activity of this alpha toxin, what do we observe? If we put anti-alpha toxin in one half of the this Petri plate, we'll see that no opalescence is present. So it is the lecithinase activity of this particular bacteria which is producing opalescence, right? So what is this test known as? This is nothing but Nadler reaction. Nadler test or Nadler reaction. Moving on to another image that is showing you a very important feature for Clostridium perfringens. It is the target hemolysis. Target hemolysis. So in this image, if we can appreciate, we are able to see there is this growth of the bacteria, and around the bacteria, are we able to see the small area showing complete hemolysis? And around this small area showing complete hemolysis, we have another zone of hemolysis. So we have two different zones of hemolysis. If we look closely, around this particular bacterial growth, we have one zone of hemolysis, and around this zone we have another zone of hemolysis. So this kind of hemolysis, it is known as target hemolysis. And how is this occurring? There is a mechanism behind it. So what is the mechanism we are talking about? This inner zone of hemolysis, it is because of this one toxin we have already discussed about in the different major and minor toxins. It is due to theta toxin. The inner zone of complete hemolysis. Complete hemolysis is because of theta toxin. And the outer zone, can we appreciate the inner zone as more clearer than the outer zone of hemolysis? So this outer zone of incomplete hemolysis, as we have already discussed, that this alpha toxin, it has this lecithinase activity, it is also hemolytic. So this outer zone of incomplete hemolysis is also because of alpha toxin. So now moving on to the next image, where we have this reverse CAMP test. And Clostridium perfringens is reverse CAMP test positive. It shows reverse CAMP test positive. So what do we have? We have this one streak of Clostridium perfringens in the image. One streak of Clostridium perfringens, right? And we have another streak of group B streptococci or Streptococcus agalactiae, which is streaked perpendicular to Clostridium perfringens infection. And because of this, there is enhanced zone of hemolysis towards the Clostridium perfringens, which this enhanced zone of hemolysis pointing towards Clostridium perfringens is showing this reverse CAMP test positive, right? So this is another important one-liner question. The reverse CAMP test positive given by Clostridium perfringens. So these are all important image-based questions which can get asked from Clostridium perfringens. Now moving on to another important Clostridium species, that is Clostridium tetani. So Clostridium tetani, we have already discussed that this shows drumstick appearance, right? We have terminal spherical spores. Right? And Clostridium tetani, it is responsible for tetanus infection. So what is the habitat of Clostridium tetani? All of these Clostridia, these majorly are present as saprophytes in the environment, but these can also be present as commensals in human intestines as well. They can be found in aquatic bodies, water bodies, fresh waters, etc. So the habitat of Clostridium tetani, it is soil majorly. We say soil, it can be present in soil, it can be present ubiquitously in the environment, right? So it is responsible for tetanus. So with tetanus, we can derive from the name itself that it is going to have two important manifestations. One is autonomic disturbances. A for AN for autonomic, as well as S stands for a condition which is spastic paralysis. So what is occurring in Clostridium botulinum? it is causing flaccid paralysis. Why? Because of blockage of ACH release at the nerve terminals, right? Neuromuscular junction. ACH is not released, which is leading to flaccid paralysis. And in this condition, in this bacterial infection, there's going to be spastic paralysis. So, two important points for tetanus. We have autonomic disturbances and spastic paralysis, right? So, what are the virulence factors which are responsible for tetanus infection? So, Clostridium tetani produces two types of exotoxins. One is titanolysin and titanospasmin. Titanolysin and titanospasmin. So why have I highlighted these two letters from the toxins? So titanolysin, it is oxygen labile, one thing, and it is also lazy. We'll use it as a mnemonic. It is lazy, so it has no role in pathogenesis. One thing. Then what is this? Titanospasmin. Spasmin, we can derive the word spasm. So it is this toxin which is responsible for spastic paralysis, one thing. And this is oxygen stable. And it is going to be responsible for spastic paralysis. Right? So, two important things to remember from titanospasmin and titanolysin. So, this is the toxin, exotoxin, which is responsible for its pathogenesis. Now, moving on to the mechanism of action of this bacteria or the toxin. So, let's use this fun mnemonic, Tinku Singh pigs, right? So, what do we derive from T and S from Tinku Singh? It is the titanospasmin. Titanospasmin. So, with pigs, let us see what is happening with pig. So, this toxin, this titanospasmin, it is acting with P, it is acting presynaptically. It is acting presynaptically, one thing. And it is acting on inhibitory neurotransmitters. It is preventing the release of inhibitory neurotransmitters. Prevents release of inhibitory neurotransmitters. And what are these inhibitory neurotransmitters? G. What is this G stand for? G stands for glycine and GABA. Glycine and GABA. Right? So, what is the inhibition of these or prevention of release of these inhibitory neurotransmission leading to? It is leading to what? It is leading to spastic paralysis. Spastic paralysis. And what group of muscles are these affecting? These are affecting the extensor group of muscles, right? So, Tinku Singh pigs, titanospasmin, P, it is acting presynaptically and it is preventing the release of inhibitory neurotransmitters. Inhibitory neurotransmitters. And what are these inhibitory neurotransmitters? We have glycine and GABA, and which is leading to the development of spastic paralysis, right? So, Tinku Singh has pinged someone and it is leading to development of spastic paralysis. So, let's see this with the help of an image. So what is this toxin? We have tetanus toxin. So it is the Clostridium tetani which is releasing this tetanospasmin. So what is this tetanospasmin doing? It is blocking the release of inhibitory neurotransmitters, right? And what are these transmitters? We have already discussed about GABA and glycine. And because of this, there is CNS, it is acting on those CNS motor neurons we have already discussed about. So there's continuous excitatory stimulus, but there is no inhibitory stimulus, which is leading to what? It is leading to spastic paralysis, right? So what are the modes of transmission? First thing, road traffic accidents can be one mode of transmission. Then if the surgical procedures are not done in sterile conditions, right? And there is unsterile abortions, unsterile surgeries which are done. So when asepsis is not maintained, it is leading to development of such condition, tetanus. And road traffic accidents, we must know that once we have such accidents, what is the first vaccine that we take? It is the tetanus toxoid vaccine we are taking in order to prevent or in order to, act as prerequisite for not getting such infections, right? So now talking about the clinical manifestations which this Clostridium species lead to. So again, we have this mnemonic, this extended mnemonic, that is Tinku Singh locks the door and pings Rinku Singh. So he's locking the door and he's texting some Rinku Singh. So right. So with Tinku Singh, we again have tetanospasmin. And can we also write trismus with Tinku Singh? Trismus. Then with lock, can we write lockjaw? Right? Then we have D for door, and so we have exaggerated deep tendon reflexes. So in botulinum toxin, which had flaccid paralysis, we have seen that there was decreased deep tendon reflexes. So here we have exaggerated deep tendon reflexes. And with A, we can write there are autonomic disturbances. And with autonomic disturbances, we can very well say that patient might have increased or decreased blood pressure, patient might have tachycardia, sweating, etc. Right? So there are autonomic disturbances which can occur. Then Rinku Singh, R stands for Rhesus sardonicus. And S stands for spastic paralysis. Right? So these are all the clinical manifestations which can follow after Clostridium tetani infection. So if given in exams, the case-based scenarios or the image-based questions, so what is this position? This is opus totalis, which occurs because of some condition which is affecting the extensor muscles of the body. There's this position that the person infected with Clostridium tetani bacteria or having tetanus, this is the arched body that this patient develops, which is known as the opus totalis position, right? Then there is this lockjaw condition which is occurring, lockjaw. When there is increased tone of masseter muscle, right? And this condition, this grinning state, because of the increased tone of masseter muscle, and this condition, it is known as Rhesus sardonicus. a grinning condition, which is pathognomic of tetanus infection, right? So these images you can get along with the image of a bacilli, and you can be asked about the toxins and anything related to that. A case-based scenario is very, very commonly asked from this section. So now we have discussed majorly about the types of toxins, the clinical manifestations, the mechanisms of those manifestations and the toxins, right? So let's just revise points or some important one-liners for Clostridium species. So what is the bacilli which is leading to spastic paralysis? It is the Clostridium tetani. And what is the species which is causing flaccid paralysis? It is Clostridium botulinum. Botulinum, right? Which bacteria, which species has drumstick appearance? Again, it is Clostridium tetani. Which bacilli or which species is leading to development of floppy baby syndrome where we have flaccid paralysis? It is Clostridium botulinum. And what is the most common condition which leads to floppy baby syndrome? What is one such risk factor? It is the honey ingestion. Honey ingestion which is leading to floppy baby syndrome. What is that one stubby boxcar shaped bacilli which is present without the spores in the peripheral smears or on cultures? It is the Clostridium perfringens. And are these spores bulging or non-bulging? Of course, these are bulging spores, Clostridia. And what are the species? What is the bacilli which produces non-bulging spores? It is the Bacillus species. Right? So now let us just revise the types of toxins. We have already discussed about Clostridium species. So Clostridium difficile. For Clostridium difficile, we have toxin A and toxin B. Toxin A sounds similar to entering, right? So it is enterotoxin. Enterotoxin. Toxin B, it is a cytotoxin. Now, botulinum toxin, numb stands for numbing effect, right? So it has some neurological condition occurring. So it is a neurotoxin. Neurotoxin. And what is Clostridium tetani? Tetani, it produces two toxins, exotoxins, tetanospasmin and tetanolysin. So tetanospasmin, it is producing spastic paralysis. So it is a very potent neurotoxin. It is a very potent neurotoxin, right? And what is Clostridium perfringens? It has a lot of toxins, alpha toxin, beta major and minor toxins. But what is the major role of these toxins? These can be cytotoxins, enterotoxins majorly. So these can have multiple functions or multiple mechanisms of toxic manifestations, right? So this is all about the different Clostridium species, their clinical manifestations, the mechanisms of toxins, their sites of actions, and as well as the differentiation, the morphological characteristics. So this was about the species Clostridium, the important species under Clostridium genus. Thank you.